Why does God permit human suffering? Well, that's an easy one, isn't it? It's one of the first things we learned when we got the truth. How many times have we explained from the scriptures that Jehovah's sovereignty needs to be vindicated because the devil challenged it? And his name needs to be sanctified because Satan has reproached it. And lovers of Jehovah need to keep integrity, remain faithful under difficult circumstances, because Satan holds no one loves Jehovah or his sovereignty that much. Yes, if there's anything we know how to explain from our years of study of the scriptures, it is why God permits human suffering. And yet, when we're the ones suffering, when we ourselves encounter trialsome situations, an amazing thing happens. We start to ask, well, why is Jehovah permitting this? Have I displeased him? Have I lost his favor? Is Jehovah punishing me for something? In other words, why is Jehovah permitting my human suffering? And we know the answer. It's the same answer. It's just that as humans, it is so easy for us to lose focus when we're the ones suffering. It's easy for us to get absorbed in our own problems, our troubles, even to the point where relatively minor issues loom large in our mind, and we temporarily lose perspective. Even so, if we look outside ourselves and view our personal circumstances in the light of Jehovah's purpose to vindicate his sovereignty, things make more sense, we feel a little better, we're even in a better position to cope. Therefore, when we catch ourselves becoming overly self-absorbed, we need to give ourselves an important reminder, namely, the big issue is Jehovah's purpose to vindicate his sovereignty, which we support by remaining faithful under difficult circumstances. It's not new light. It's one of the first things we learned when we got the truth. But it does remind us why we do not expect Jehovah to shield us from all difficulties in this system. As our kingdom song number 17 says, soldiers of Jah, do not seek a life of ease. Not in this system. No, now is the time to uphold Jehovah's sovereignty by our integrity. Well, what can help us not just grasp that perspective, but call it to mind as needed? That's what this talk is about. And we're going to approach it with three questions. First, what are some Bible accounts that can remind us to view our circumstances in the light of Jehovah's purpose to vindicate his sovereignty? Number two, does the great importance of Jehovah's sovereignty render us unimportant to God? And number three, how can you and I best uphold Jehovah's sovereignty? So first, some Bible accounts, starting with this one. Who said these sharp, cutting words? The injury done to me is your fault. May Jehovah judge between me and you. Who said that? Well, I think you know. But let's get the context. Genesis 16:5 gives us the quote in its entirety. Genesis 16:5 says, at this Sarai said to Abram, the injury done to me is your fault. I was the one who put my servant in your arms, but when she realized that she was pregnant, she began to despise me. May Jehovah judge between me and you. So, this was Sarah speaking to Abraham. Is this the same Sarah who called Abraham my Lord in her heart? The very one. So why was she so upset in this instance? Well, we know Jehovah had promised Abraham offspring. Sarah got to reasoning that she was past childbearing age. She offered her servant Hagar as a concubine for Abraham. Nowhere do the scriptures condemn that decision as faithless or immoral. Even so, to give her husband a child by means of another woman, that could not have been an easy thing for Sarah to do. And then on top of that, Hagar uses her pregnancy as a reason to treat Sarah as inferior. All of this put a new tension into the home of Abraham and Sarah, an ongoing domestic strain that they had to live with, no doubt, over some period of time. And what do you think was harder for Abraham and Sarah to live with, dwelling in tents or this? It was a trial. So here's a question. Couldn't Jehovah have spared Abraham and Sarah a lot of grief by telling Abraham early on that the mother of the promised offspring would be Sarah? Right? How many times had Jehovah spoken to Abraham about this promised offspring? And yet he did not disclose that Sarah would be the mother until Ishmael was in his early teens? What happened there? At the very least, couldn't Jehovah have intervened when Sarah began to offer Hagar as a concubine for Abraham? Why didn't Jehovah say anything or do anything? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us. But when we give ourselves that important reminder to view this account in the light of Jehovah's purpose, what do we see? We see that those periodic communications from Jehovah to Abraham were not about sparing Abraham from difficulties, domestic or otherwise. No. Those communications from Jehovah to Abraham were about furthering Jehovah's developing purpose. Outside of that, Abraham and Sarah had to do pretty much like other servants of God, work through life's difficulties and live as best they could with the decisions they've made. In other words, Abraham's role did not exempt him from suffering. It meant just the opposite, remaining faithful to Jehovah despite the suffering. And Abraham and Sarah did that. They continued to worship Jehovah faithfully through the hardships, and Jehovah treasured their integrity, even calling Abraham my friend. Here's the point. This account involving Abraham and Sarah takes us back to the important reminder that the big issue really is Jehovah's purpose to vindicate his sovereignty, which we support by remaining faithful under difficult circumstances. So, perhaps like Abraham, you're suffering the undesirable results of a decision that you made in the past. Not necessarily a poor decision or a wrong decision. It could have been, we're imperfect, but it might have just been a decision that you made in good faith. You even prayed about it. But now, in retrospect, you look back and you feel that if you had only known the undesirable consequences that would ensue, you'd have made a different choice. Now you pray that Jehovah will relieve you of its ongoing ramifications, but there is no relief in sight. Why is Jehovah permitting this to go on? Because you've displeased him? Because you lost his favor? No, you are upholding Jehovah's sovereignty by serving him faithfully under difficult circumstances, and Jehovah treasures your integrity. Now, this next Bible account involves one of Jehovah's faithful servants who agonized over a situation that existed only in his own mind. Let's read about it at Genesis chapter 37. Here we read about Jacob, who is told that Joseph, his favorite son, was dead. We read his response at Genesis 37, verses 34 and 35. It says, "With that, Jacob ripped his garments apart and put sackcloth around his waist and mourned his son for many days. And all his sons and all his daughters kept trying to comfort him, but he kept refusing to take comfort, saying, I will go down into the grave mourning my son. And his father continued weeping for him. So yes, Jacob was profoundly affected by the apparent death of his son, as any parent would be. The fact that he had many other children did not eliminate his grief. But here's the irony. Joseph was not dead. He was alive. Jacob didn't know that. He believed Joseph was dead. And so he went through all the stages of grief, just as if Joseph had actually died. So here's our question. Couldn't Jehovah have spared Jacob this heartache by appearing to him in a dream, as he had on previous occasions, and just told him, Jacob, have no fear. Joseph's alive. Why didn't Jehovah do that? Again, the Bible doesn't tell us. But when we give ourselves that important reminder to view this account in the light of Jehovah's purpose, what do we see? We see that Jehovah's occasional communications with Jacob were not about shielding him from hardship. Jacob's role in Jehovah's purpose did not mean being exempt. It meant serving Jehovah despite the hardships, because those communications from Jehovah to Jacob were about Jehovah's furthering purpose, in which Jacob had a role, but it meant remaining faithful under hardship. And Jacob did that. Jacob did not abandon Jehovah. He didn't reason, look, if Jehovah cannot protect my son on a simple errand out there, then he's no more powerful than the gods of the nations. No. Jacob kept serving Jehovah even with tears. And Jehovah treasured his integrity. Centuries later, Jehovah was still calling himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Here's the point. This account about Jacob takes us back to the important reminder that the big issue really is Jehovah's purpose to vindicate his sovereignty, which we support by remaining faithful under difficult circumstances. So perhaps, like Jacob, you might be going through a period where you're serving Jehovah with tears. It could be due to the loss of a loved one in death. It could be due to the loss of a loved one to Satan's world. Or it could even be a problem that exists primarily in the mind, like ongoing depression. Why is Jehovah permitting this to go on? He's punishing me. I've lost his favor. I've displeased him. No. You are upholding Jehovah's sovereignty by continuing to serve him faithfully under difficult circumstances. And Jehovah treasures your integrity. Now, this third account is a little different. It's about a man whose biggest test of integrity might lie ahead in the new world, and that would be Uriah, who will inevitably learn that David had relations with his wife and then married her. And he will learn another detail, one that might just drive home to him just how cruelly he was betrayed. Now, as we read about it in 2 Samuel 11, imagine yourself as Uriah in the new world, reading these words for the first time. 2 Samuel 11, verses 14 and 15. It says, in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. He wrote in the letter, put Uriah in the front lines where the fighting is the fiercest, then retreat from behind him so that he will be struck down and die. So yes, Uriah will learn that that letter that he personally delivered to Joab, and that he evidently didn't take a peek at along the way, contained orders for his own death signed by David. Will Uriah forgive repentant David? Could be a test for him, couldn't it? But that may not be Uriah's biggest spiritual challenge. What about reconciling himself with the fact that Jehovah allowed these things to happen to him and then forgave David and then allowed David to retain the kingship? How will Uriah feel about that? How will he feel about the fact that Jehovah exalted David to one of the most honored individuals in the Bible record? Seems as if every king thereafter was graded as either good or bad, depending on how close he came to David's example. And how will Uriah feel about the fact that Jehovah chose Solomon, a son by David and Bathsheba, to become the next king and to write Bible books? Will Uriah take the position, look, if that's the kind of God Jehovah is, if that's his idea of justice, I want nothing further to do with him? Will he nurture the attitude that, I guess, from Jehovah's viewpoint, if you're a Jew like David, you can do anything you want and it's all right. But if you're a man of the nations like me, a Hittite, you just don't count? Or will Uriah do like 1 Peter 5:6 says, humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time? Yes, will Uriah humbly endeavor to see his betrayal in the light of Jehovah's purpose and then work to further that purpose? Well, of course, we don't know whether these matters will even be issues for Uriah in the New World. The Bible doesn't comment on that. The thing is, though, when we read this account through the eyes of Uriah, like we just did, what stands out? What just jumps off the page? Well, Uriah was cruelly betrayed. He was a victim of a horrible injustice. But when we give ourselves that important reminder to view this account in the light of Jehovah's purpose, what do we see? That it wasn't about Uriah or his life or his wife. It was about Jehovah's purpose, which guarantees that God will in due time more than compensate for all the injustices experienced in this system. Here's the point. This account involving Uriah takes us back to the important reminder that the big issue really is Jehovah's purpose to vindicate his sovereignty, which we support by remaining faithful under difficult circumstances. So at times we might feel that Uriah, like Uriah, at least to some extent, we've been mistreated, misunderstood, or overlooked in some way. But we don't allow that to distance us from Jehovah or from his organization. Rather, we wait on Jehovah to resolve issues in his due time, in his way. Yes, from all three of these accounts, and from other accounts that we don't have time to analyze tonight, we learn that the big issue is Jehovah's purpose. Now, it's true, we could locate other Bible accounts where Jehovah did preserve his people, spared them from calamity, and it did not seem to directly relate to his purpose. But those seem to be the exception, not the rule. For the most part, Jehovah's ancient servants had to live through and endure injustice, oppression, difficult circumstances in the home, health problems, and hardships, even heartaches. Jehovah's servants had to endure them. And so it is today. We do not expect Jehovah to shield us from all difficulties in this system. Rather, we remain faithful through the hardships. We remind ourselves that Jehovah's purpose is the big issue and everything else is secondary at best. Even our eternal salvation is secondary to the vindication of Jehovah's sovereignty. And our eternal salvation is also secondary to the sanctification of God's name. It's not new light. It's one of the first things we learned when we got the truth, but it's an important reminder we need to give ourselves on occasion, because it is key to answering that question, why is Jehovah permitting my human suffering? The answer? not because you displeased him, not because you lost his favor, but because you're upholding Jehovah's sovereignty by your integrity, and Jehovah treasures your faithfulness. Well, let's move on to our second question. Does this great importance of Jehovah's sovereignty render us unimportant to Jehovah? Does it mean that he's calloused to our sufferings, insensitive to our feelings? Not in the least. Jehovah was very sensitive to Abraham's feelings, even blessing Ishmael on Abraham's account. And Jehovah was very sensitive to Sarah. He loved her and dignified her as the mother of the promised offspring. And what tender regard Jehovah showed for Jacob by arranging for him to be reunited with Joseph for many years. And Jehovah is sensitive to your feelings too. What, though, about that statement that we made just moments ago, that our eternal salvation is secondary to Jehovah's vindication and sanctification? Does that statement belittle our salvation? Does it render our salvation unimportant? Does it put our salvation at risk? As if to suggest, well, should the day ever come when Jehovah has to choose between vindication and salvation, we're all going to lose. Well, of course it doesn't mean that. But let's explain. In his great love, Jehovah has deliberately arranged matters so that the eternal salvation of faithful humans is part of the vindication of his sovereignty and the sanctification of his name. So let me repeat that because it's fundamental to this point. Jehovah has deliberately arranged matters so that the salvation of obedient humans is part of his vindication and salvation. How so? Let's read 2 Peter chapter 3. We read this during the Watchtower study. We're going to look at a different aspect of it just now. 2 Peter 3:13 says, "But there are new heavens and a new earth that we are awaiting according to his promise, and in these righteousness is to dwell." So here we have one of numerous Bible verses that impress upon us that the eternal salvation of obedient humans into new heavens or new earth, that's a promise from Jehovah. This isn't something that he mentions in passing or casually. It's a promise. And so, our question, would Jehovah's name be sanctified if, having made these promises, Jehovah was to belittle salvation by failing to bring it about? Would that sanctify Jehovah's name? Wouldn't it really have the opposite effect? Justifying the devil and reproaching God's name by calling God a liar? Wouldn't it provide ammunition for these opposers who say, where's this promised presence of his? See, there it is. Jehovah has deliberately arranged matters so that salvation, the eternal salvation of obedient humans, is part of the sanctification of his name. You could say that Jehovah has put salvation in a very safe place because it's part of the sanctification of his name. It is also part of the vindication of his sovereignty. How so? Salvation is something that Jehovah cares about very much. He cares about our salvation. Why? Because he loves us so much. Nobody loves us like Jehovah. Not our parents, not our friends, not our mates. No one loves us like Jehovah. But all that love from Jehovah, the tender regard he has for each of his human servants, that desire he has to listen to our prayers and to bless us beyond anything we could ever deserve, all that love from Jehovah is part of his sovereignty. It's part of the way he rules. It's part of the very sovereignty that he's vindicating. Here's the point. The importance of Jehovah's sovereignty does not render us or our salvation unimportant to him. In stating that our salvation is secondary to Jehovah's sanctification and vindication, we're not belittling salvation. We are simply keeping vindication and salvation in proper perspective and giving ourselves the important reminder that the vindication of Jehovah's sovereignty is the big issue. Let's move on. Our third question: how can we each support and uphold Jehovah's sovereignty? Well, we've already talked about one way, haven't we? By integrity. So let's talk about a second way: by maintaining joy in Bethel service. Or we could say maintaining joy in sacred service overall. Psalm 102 says, serve Jehovah with rejoicing. Deuteronomy 7:12 says, you must rejoice in all your undertakings. Nehemiah 8:10 says, the joy of Jehovah is your stronghold. Peter, James, Paul, Jesus himself counseled Christians to rejoice even under difficult circumstances. The question is why? What is so important about joy? And what's it to do with the all-important issue of Jehovah's sovereignty? Well, one longtime member of the Bethel family put it this way. He says, suppose Jehovah said to Satan about you or about another of his faithful servants, there is my faithful servant. He kept integrity to the end. And Satan said, that's true, he did. But he hated every minute of it. He was miserable all the time. What would that say about Jehovah's sovereignty? What would that say about Jehovah's way of ruling? Now, it's true what we said earlier. We all pass through periods of time where we serve Jehovah with tears. And that's not because of Jehovah's way of ruling. That's because we live in the devil's world. So we serve with tears. At least we serve. We keep integrity. We're faithful. Jehovah loves us for that. He treasures it. He keeps our tears in his skin bottle. We go through those periods. But as a general pattern, we give the best answer and the best support to Jehovah's sovereignty if we learn to serve him with joy. Not just the natural joy that can be acquired from self-help or acquired by rising above adversity, but godly joy, the joy of Jehovah, the joy that comes from knowing we have his approval and from immersing ourselves in his service. So again, while in principle we're talking about sacred service in general, since most of us here tonight are members of the Bethel family, regular or temporary, let's take a few minutes to discuss the question, how can we maintain joy in our Bethel service despite its challenges? Now, some who have never served at Bethel might just shake their heads at a question like that and wonder, how could anybody serve in a happy place like this and not be joyful all the time? But we who serve here know it's a happy place, joyful, no question. And yet our joy can be challenged in a variety of ways. Well, not only do we appreciate that, so do many brothers and sisters who used to serve at Bethel in the past. You must have had that experience, yes, where you sit back with a brother, a sister, a couple who used to serve here, and you get to talking about Bethel, and they understand you completely. They remember, they haven't forgotten. If you told them that you recently participated in a room bid and you accidentally inverted the figures and obtained the worst room on that list, they would feel your pain. I think if you told them you gleaned a couple of hamburgers last week, they'd know what that put you through. You risked your life for that food, didn't you? But they would remember. Many years ago, I remember a member of the Bethel family telling me that in some respects, life at Bethel was more difficult than the many years they'd spent as prisoners in Germany during the Holocaust. Well, how was that statement meant to be understood? In what way could Bethel be harder? Here's how it was explained to me. As a prisoner, it was always easy to know what Jehovah wanted you to do. Sometimes it was difficult to do the right thing, but to know what the right thing was simple. The issue was as clear as black and white. It was what today we would call a no-brainer. But at Bethel, facing things like, what does Jehovah want me to do? How does he want me to balance my work assignment with my field ministry, with my other congregation activity, with my personal study, my marriage, time for necessary rest? Seems like no matter how many different ways I try to balance it out, I'm always left feeling like something spiritual is being neglected. Well, all this to say, Bethel life has its challenges, and of course, most of the trials we face are more serious and painful than the ones we've described as examples. Some of our trials are large, others are smaller but significant. Some of our trials are common to all mankind, others are unique to serving here. But it takes a spiritual person to make a success of Bethel service and to maintain joy despite the challenges. Well, that just brings us right back to our question. How can we maintain joy at Bethel despite the challenges? Let's turn to Romans chapter 11. These inspired words at Romans 11:13, where Paul wrote, "Now I speak to you who are people of the nations, seeing that I'm an apostle to the nations, I glorify my ministry." And now we ask, what ministry? What ministry did Paul glorify? To what ministry did he have reference? To the ministry in general, the preaching and teaching work worldwide? No. In context, Paul had reference to his particular, specific assignment within that great ministry. Paul was an apostle to the nations, and he treasured that assignment. He magnified it, as the footnote says. He valued it as a high privilege. Not that he thought his assignment made him better than other Christians, not that he looked down on others. Paul did not glorify himself, but he glorified his ministry. He made no apologies there. Paul did not view his ministry as an apostle to the nations as less honorable than, say, witnessing exclusively to Jews, something that Paul probably could have done very well given his former history as a Pharisee. And Paul did not view his apostleship to the nations as less honorable than organizing the work globally from Jerusalem with the apostles and the older men there. He viewed his assignment as a privilege of the highest order. He learned to carry it out skillfully and to benefit others. Paul appreciated the supreme value of the assignment that he was given. And that's how we need to feel about our assignment, Bethel service. As Paul glorified his ministry, we need to treasure our assignment. If you are serving here at Bethel, that is a special assignment. Treasure it, magnify it, don't minimize it, not even in your mind, because we will lose our joy. And we'll lose perspective if we ever start to believe in our hearts that Bethel service is somehow less honorable, less important, less spiritual than all those other full-time privileges out there. Now, of course, we know that each of us needs to have a personal share in the actual field service and other essential spiritual activity. And we want to. We have our heart in those things. But that should be a given. It remains that properly motivated, our work here at Bethel is sacred full-time service. Whatever your specific assignment at Bethel, it is a special part of getting the good news preached earthwide. Here's the point. Bethel service counts. That doesn't mean we can count our Bethel time on our field service reports. I already checked the new edition of the organized book. No, but reminding ourselves that Bethel service is a spiritual privilege and treating it as such, that's key to maintaining joy. Joy that outweighs the challenges. Joy that, coupled with integrity, upholds Jehovah's sovereignty. Now, some have voiced the concern, how can I have joy in my specific Bethel assignment? And why remind myself of how important it is when at any given time in the future, for all I know, I might receive a different assignment outside of Bethel or inside, job change. And it's a big subject, but just in the context of this talk, we've discussed how Jehovah dealt with Abraham, Sarah, Jacob, and how Jehovah did not tell them everything. They served Jehovah with what he had disclosed to them, confident that he would take care of their yet uncertain future. Now, that's the way Jehovah works. Even perfect Adam and Eve were not told everything that Jehovah had in mind for them and for the earth. They were basically told, this is your assignment for now. And so it is with us. Jehovah does not tell us everything. Yes, he tells the outcome from the beginning when it has to do with his purpose, but he does not tell you or me what we will be doing and how we will be serving him next year, the following year, or the year after that. That is not how Jehovah deals with us. It is not how he gives us joy. It is not how he gives us his peace. How does he do it then? Well, rather than making our joy dependent on a certain job assignment or type of work or privilege, Jehovah wants us to look to him for joy on our current assignments as we serve him a day at a time. Psalm 37:4 says, find exquisite delight in Jehovah. Footnote says, find your greatest joy in Jehovah. That's the way Jehovah gives us joy. And it is the only way to maintain joy in sacred service, any form of sacred service. Now, it also means we need to do like Psalm 73:26 says, make Jehovah the rock of our heart, the source of our emotional stability. It's natural for us to feel apprehensive for our future, especially in a climate of rapid change. I don't think any of us are immune to these feelings. But if we give into uncontrolled worry, we will not only suffer emotionally and maybe physically too, but more important, we'll miss an opportunity to make Jehovah our reason for feeling secure and safe. And we can't afford to miss an opportunity to do that. Why not? Why do we need to seize every opportunity to practice making Jehovah our confidence? Because at some point, every one of us, of the other sheep, will be either at the brink of Armageddon or in the grave. And in either situation, only Jehovah can save us. And he will. But we need to use every opportunity now to make him our reason for feeling safe, stable, and secure. We need to make our personal tie with Jehovah stronger than anything else. Here's the point. Let's treasure our Bethel service. Let's find joy in our specific assignments, but let's make Jehovah our refuge. With Jehovah as our strength, and in imitation of the Apostle Paul, we can glorify and magnify any aspect of the ministry to which we may be assigned. Well, it's been a lot of words. Can we summarize this talk? I won't say in one word or less. Can we summarize this talk in a sentence? A long sentence. Maybe this way. Whenever we get to wondering, why is Jehovah permitting my human suffering? We can give ourselves an important reminder to view matters in the light of Jehovah's purpose, to vindicate his sovereignty, which we support by our integrity and joyful service. Now, a final point in conclusion. Let's not forget that Jehovah's permission of human suffering is temporary and that he will abundantly reward those who uphold his sovereignty. Meditating on the reward can help us to remain faithful and to maintain joy. Some to whom we preach find the new world hard to believe, To them, it's too good to be true, just a fantasy that's not worth wasting time dreaming about it. But when you know the truth, isn't it so? This is the world that's hard to believe. We believe it only because we're here. We can't deny it. It's all too real to us. But imagine yourself describing this world to someone born in the paradise earth. What might that person say to you in return? Maybe something like this. Are you sure you're not exaggerating? Could it have been as bad as you describe? How could anyone live every day under such stressful circumstances? Conceivably, someone might say something like that because this is the world that's hard to believe. Jehovah's promised new world will simply be normal. Really, everything about it, the endless life, the vibrant health, the pleasant associations, the uninhibited relationship with Jehovah, all that is normal. That is the life for which we're designed. And that is the life that Jehovah promises to those who uphold his sovereignty. Now, Satan says he has something better. Come under my sovereignty, he says. I will let you design your own moral code. You'll be happier. Really? Even if Satan could do it, and he can't come close to what Jehovah is going to accomplish, but just for the sake of argument, if he could do it, if he could match it, if he could produce a world without sorrow, without sickness, without death, it would still be a world without Jehovah. And lovers of Jehovah find that offensive. We don't want it. We want Jehovah ruling over us. We want God's sovereignty. And we show it now by our integrity and joyful service. So let us, as often as necessary, give ourselves this important reminder. Now is the time to support the big issue, Jehovah's sovereignty.